Hi, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for our journalist reaction to Julian Assange's public testimony this morning. Julian Assange, as you all know, gave his first public comments since his release from prison and his freedom back in June. He testified before the Committee of Legal Affairs and Human Rights of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, France. His testimony precedes the debate the council is going to have tomorrow on their draft resolution pertaining to the persecution, prosecution, and jailing of Julian over the last 14 years. That resolution, it's informed by a report that was prepared by this committee. And both that report and the draft resolution, along with the video of Julian's testimony, is available, or they are available in the links in the description of our program. So please, when we're done here, if you haven't watched his testimony, haven't looked at the resolution or the report, please do so. But I do want to quote the Council of Europe's Committee of Legal Affairs, one aspect of what they said, because this is so key. This is what so many of us have been arguing and fighting for over these last 15 years. The disproportionately severe charges brought against Julian Assange by the United States of America, as well as heavy penalties foreseen under the Espionage Act for engaging in acts of journalism, fulfill the requirements set out in a 2012 Assembly resolution on the definition of political prisoner. So you see there, Council of Europe saying Julian Assange has been and was a political prisoner. And then finally, before we begin the program, bring our panelists on, I do want to quote one part of what Julian said in his testimony today. And again, please go and watch the testimony. But what Julian said, I am not free today because the system worked. I am free today because after years of incarceration, I pleaded guilty to journalism. I pleaded guilty to seeking information from a source. And I pleaded guilty to informing the public what that information was. So here to talk today about Julian's testimony and the broader threats to free speech and to journalism, including where we go from here. We have three experts on this, people who have been involved in this throughout its time. And these people, our folks we bring on today, have been involved in covering, analyzing, speaking on behalf of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks for the last 14, 15 years. Marjorie Cohn is a professor emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, Dean of the People's Academy of International Law, and past president of the National Lawyers Guild. She sits on the national advisory boards of Assange Defense and Veterans for Peace. A member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, she is the U.S. representative to the Continental Advisory Council of the Association of American Jurists. Her books include Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues. She has covered Julian Assange's case for Truth Out. Chip Gibbons is the policy director of Defending Rights and Dissent, where he has advised members of Congress on reforming the Espionage Act. In addition to being one of the leading experts on the press freedom implications of the Espionage Act, Chip covered the Assange extradition hearings as a journalist for Jacobin. Chip is currently working on a new history of FBI political surveillance for Verso book, which explores the role of domestic surveillance in the making of the U.S. national security state. He leads Defending Rights and Dissent's efforts to use the Freedom of Information Act to compel the FBI to release its files on WikiLeaks and its founder, Julian Assange. And Kevin Gostala is the author of Guilty of Journalism, the political case against Julian Assange. He is one of the few journalists who reported on both the military court-martial against Chelsea Manning and the extradition proceedings against Assange. He has covered Espionage Act prosecutions and whistleblower cases for nearly 15 years. And Kevin edits the Dissenter newsletter at thedissenter.org, which focuses on press freedom, whistleblowers, and government secrecy. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. First, just want to talk about what you all saw and heard this morning, in particular, how you felt seeing Julian speak as a free man for the first time. And so, Marjorie, if we can begin with you, please.
Yes, Matt. Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this important panel and this historic event. I was incredibly moved by Julian's testimony and the fact that he is a free man. I and other people on this panel and people around the world have really fought with him side by side for many years to try to achieve his freedom. And he is, of course, free. I thought he was incredibly articulate on top of all of the issues, responded without missing a beat for somebody who has been locked away for all those years and suffered psychological torture, in the words of the UN Special Rapporteur, and almost at his wit's end, a suicide risk, one judge found in the UK. But I thought that he just did an excellent job. I was just so impressed and happy to see him there.
Matt, you might be trying to reach me, but are muted.
I am muted. Thank you. We've only been doing this for how long, guys? Right? When are we going to get,
You and I have been doing this since the withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Oh, before, right? And to Marjorie's point, though, Julian was so on point. I mean, he really was. I mean, didn't miss a beat, as Marjorie said. I'm sure he didn't have any problems unmuting himself during the panel discussion like I do. So, but Kevin, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, so as I watched Julian Assange, like everyone here, it was moving and profound. What I paid close attention to, though, was the way in which he was willing or allowed himself to show his vulnerability, to show that he is not the person that he was before he was expelled from Ecuador's London embassy, and before he even entered house arrest while he was still the editor-in-chief for WikiLeaks, that he told everyone there's limitations to what I can do. I'm still adapting. And because people in the corporate or establishment press might seize upon it to make him seem feeble at this moment, I'll note that he was constantly clearing his throat when he was reading his prepared statement. And I could tell that there was a lot of nervous energy. He seemed to be, it was like reflux was in his throat, that he was having trouble. But all of the words were moving. Everything he was saying, it was hitting with the parliamentarians that were there at the committee. And then I noticed something remarkable, which was when he stepped aside from the prepared remarks and he was fielding questions from these parliamentarians, he loosened up and was easy and started to very fluidly answer questions. And we got to see that Julian Assange that everybody remembers, the Julian Assange that could eloquently break down issues. He was connecting the statements that he made about his case to current events, speaking about the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine. He was knowledgeable about how much of society had changed since he was first incarcerated and since he was even living under political asylum. And so I just thought it was good to see that Julian Assange has so much of his faculty still intact after we've been told. I mean, it would have been possible to use a very widespread political reference here. It would have been understandable if someone thought they were going to get a person who spoke like Joe Biden. And it seemed like his brain was scrambled from all of what he had endured. And yet a very poignant moment to me was seeing that his sense of humor was intact and he was able to make a joke that landed about his mother-in-law that went over very well with the people there. And this is all like, I'm speaking kind of like somebody who just focuses on human interest stories. I am interested in much more. Obviously, we're going to speak about the issues of freedom of the press. But I think all of these things just go to show about the resiliency of his spirit and how incredible it was that he was there and that he defied the paranoia that he must have been feeling, which he alluded to at the beginning. The last thing I'll say, he seemed to allude to, that paranoia in the back of his head that I can't leave Australia now and go back into the belly of the beast and go to Europe. I might be picked up by the CIA and the intelligence apparatus that has been targeting me relentlessly. he didn't give into that fear. He stood up to it and went to that committee with Stella on his right and Christian Herafson, the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, on his left, to give him the support that he needed to get through the committee proceedings.
Right. I think that was so noticeable, their presence, right? That support for him, but also too the dynamic. I'm glad you brought up the mother-in-law joke, because Stella's response was to very comically turn his microphone off on him after he made that joke. And to see that husband and wife dynamic there, I think was really important for a lot of us, because we understand the legal implications of this. We understand the societal implications of this. We understand what it means in terms of our rights. But we also understand it as, you know, particularly you all who've been involved with this, the folks who are watching who've been involved for years on this. This is fundamentally about a man and his family and the political prosecution of him. The other aspect too, one thing he noted, and Chip, I'm going to go to you, but the whiplash of all this, right? And Julian said, going from being a political prisoner in Belmarsh to addressing the 46 nations and the 700 million people of the Council of Europe. You know, what are your thoughts, Chip, after watching all this?
You know, it's hard to think of an individual who's been more demonized than Julian Assange. I mean, all of us have heard the types of stories about Julian Assange that percolated in the mainstream press. I used to have to go up on the Hill and talk to people about Julian Assange, not just staffers. In one case, I won't say who, I had to meet with somebody on the Intelligence Committee, like one of the ranking Intelligence Committee members, and that's a story for when I don't have to work in Washington and can name names and talk about all the awful things people have said over the year, or just interesting things people have said over the years. And I, you know, when WikiLeaks first became a household name after the collateral murder videos, after the Afghan war logs, one of the things that was always so striking, and I think really compelled it forward, was what a compelling spokesperson Julian Assange was. You go back and you watch those speeches that still go viral, where he talks about the point of Afghanistan is not to win the war, but have an endless war, where he talks about how the German invasion of Poland, the U.S. war in Vietnam, the U.S. war in Iraq were all based on lies, the roles of deception in war making, the need for journalists to help to make a better world. And he was a really articulate spokesperson for a lot of causes that I think it was a very strange political moment. You had sort of the Occupy movement going on. You had the remnants of the anti-Iraq war movement. You had some people on the Ron Paul. You had sort of the proto-Bernie Sanders stuff. And you had all these sorts of people sort of mishmashed together. And Julian Assange was really able to synthesize and articulate so many of the concerns for bringing people together, not just with concerns with media, not just with concerns with foreign policy, with concerns with corporate power, with government power. And he was such an effective spokesperson. And I think people have forgotten that, because for the last 6 years, the stories have been about all of these, you know, alleged personality failings that people I know who know him say are bullshit. I'll just say bullshit on this stream, right? But you hear them so much in the media, and you know, as everyone has noted, when someone has been through what Julian Assange has been through, the torture, the isolation, the attempts to destroy him in body and mind, it has an impact on people. And we've all seen instances of people who were political prisoners, politically persecuted. They start off very smart, but that sort of persecution takes a toll, and they get kind of, you know, you can see what's happening with them mentally.
Yeah, no, exactly, Chip, exactly. And I think the points you all are making about his ability to still speak
yes,
to the larger picture here. And let's get into that larger picture, because one of the things that I heard Julian speak about many times, as well as the parliamentarians who were present, who were asking him questions. And Kevin, I agree with you. He was his statement was good. His response to the questions was just outstanding. And you know, and so one of the things I heard over and over again was this idea of transnational repression. I think that was probably, if we did a word cloud, that would be the phrase that pops out the most. And so, Marjorie, if we can begin with you, because there's so many components to what transnational repression is. And one of them is lawfare. And one of the things Julian says is he spoke about how he was naive, how he believed in law. And then this broader idea of lawfare, and which he described, to paraphrase him, he said, lawfare is not, in paraphrasing, lawfare is not litigation, but the targeting of one person or institution, not for the purposes of litigation or justice, but to achieve a political end. So can you expound upon that? And in particular, how does using the law, how is it used to serve and protect the ruling classes?
Well, Matt, this transnational repression, he talked about it in global terms, but most specifically, the power of the United States to intimidate other states, such as the UK, and of course the implication Israel, etc., as well as intimidate journalists to serve the ends of the powers that be in the United States. We've seen genocide before our very eyes for now almost a year in Gaza, moving into the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, with complete impunity. The U.S. government saying, well, be careful about civilians. And by the way, how many more bombs do you want? And just really covering up, providing political cover for Israel's high crimes, really. And in terms of the lawfare, we're talking about the misuse, and Julian talked about this, the misuse of or manipulation of legal processes as a tool of repression. So that Julian said, he was naive in believing in the law. The law is not just a piece of paper. They can be reinterpreted for political expediency. They are rules made by the ruling class more broadly. And if those rules don't suit what they want, they just reinterpret them. And of course, we see that a perfect example of that is the U.S. Supreme Court, which has turned into a radical right-wing group that does the bidding of the people in power, particularly the right wing. And so I think that he was really insightful at identifying the role of the law and how it serves this transnational repression. And we're seeing this all over the world. We're seeing the United States. Another example, by the way, Lebanon is sending ground troops. Israel is sending ground troops into Lebanon. The U.S. said, well, that's not such a good idea. But by the way, how can we help? And that's a perfect example.
Right. And leads into that type of the public's understanding of what's occurring, and the government's being able to just say what they want, and then the media going along with it. This leads into another aspect of where Julian really spoke quite poignantly and articulately on. Kevin, this idea about the geopolitical realities of journalists and media organizations, and particularly how their allegiances and their biases, will affect the cases they're covering, affect the stories they're covering. So can you broaden that? Talk to us a bit about how you see these geopolitical allegiances of journalists and media organizations, the effect they're having right now, and where you see that going in terms of the dangers of that, of having a journalism that is responsive to the elites and the establishment and not to journalism itself.
Yeah, as you say, this was something that Julian Assange was explicit in addressing. And I think because of the audience, and the audience was a room full of parliamentarians from the European Union, that he was, in fact, trying to acknowledge some of perhaps the way in which the committee might come up short, politically speaking, but also to acknowledge that they are engaged in particular conflicts and human rights abuses. So that's why he kept grouping Gaza and Ukraine together, I think, to recognize that as European parliamentarians, they're distinctly focused on the war that Russia launched through its invasion into Ukraine, and that they are on the side of Ukraine, full-throated and willing to deploy troops and continue to re-up arms over and over again. But then wanting to also not forget and neglect the war in Gaza with all of the journalists And to just speak to that dynamic, I'll let Chip get in more on, like the general freedom of the press question with Gaza journalists. But, what I think you're asking is the question that he was dealing with was this lack of journalistic solidarity that is out there for people. And to say that even as we have had, depending on what organization you accept, I actually take the higher number. There's been at least 170 journalists that have been killed so far, that you haven't had the outcry from them that you would expect when this has been the most deadliest conflict for those journalists. And he was linking that to the way in which people have reacted or did react to his political case, that even though this was extraordinary, he didn't feel the same groundswell of support. I suppose a better analogy, although I understand why he wouldn't go there, because I don't like the idea of pitting individual personalities against each other. I don't like, having kind of like oppression Olympics, so to speak, where you take these different people and say one case is more worthy than the other, even though that's what the establishment media tends to do. But Evan Gershkovich's case was one I thought that acutely illustrated during Julian Assange's political imprisonment who the elites are willing to consider political prisoners and who the elites are willing to not consider as political prisoners. And I suppose it's a good point to work in here, and I know you wanted me to mention this in my comments, Matthew, is that Richard Keane, who was the chair of this committee, is the Conservative Party parliamentarian from the UK who is a part of PACE. And he wrote a dissenting opinion against the report that was drafted by the Icelandic parliamentarian on the question of whether Julian Assange is a political prisoner, and came back with a resounding yes. He fits the description of a political prisoner. They'll be having this vote tomorrow in Strasbourg, France, and hopefully they do vote in the affirmative, that the committee does pass this along and seek to designate him as a political prisoner. But Richard Keane wrote a dissenting opinion in which he complained that, in fact, this report had belittled the fate of true political prisoners like those detained in Russia. And he insisted Assange was not tortured while he was held at Belmarsh. So, like, taking offense that the committee would write about abuses in Belmarsh's maximum security prison seriously, even though we know that actually that was something that was incredible to me from Julian Assange, which is that he was not comfortable speaking about his prison experiences. I think he is heavily and significantly traumatized by what he went through in those 5 years. He described witnessing hangings and murders, or he briefly mentioned that he had witnessed hangings and murders and other examples of violence. And he's scarred. And when a parliamentarian put a two-part question to him during the question portion, and part of it involved what he had observed and gone through in Belmarsh prison, he ignored it and didn't make any attempt to come back to it, and even let Richard Keane bail him out by saying, or give him a permission to not answer the question, which he was uncomfortable with dealing with, I think, on a this kind of like visceral level because of the trauma he's gone through. Richard Keane reminded that parliamentarian that everybody got only one question and they weren't supposed to be doing two-parters that were overwhelming for Julian Assange. But yeah, in general, to conclude my answer to you, I think this illustrates the dynamic that was so clear with Julian Assange and why he never was embraced by people at CNN or the New York Times as this cause celeb, which is to say that he opposes the agenda of U.S. imperialism. He is somebody who, if he doesn't, and if he doesn't always oppose it, he doesn't identify with it. He doesn't allow it to steer every decision that he makes as an editor of a media organization. Whereas at the New York Times or the Washington Post or CNN today, in particular after this invasion, which it was an invasion by Israeli troops, you're going to have people sitting around a table talking about, how do we explain this to the American people and make it seem justified, and how it fits into what the U.S. is supposed to do? And how do we show that even if you have criticisms of it and we could have done it differently, that maybe this is a good thing because it's going to work out in the United States' favor. And that's not Julian Assange. Julian Assange is not a salesman for the United States, and that deeply offended those who hold themselves out as journalists at these prestige media institutions.
Right, and we've seen this even in Julian's trials in the UK. The relationships between the elites among the establishment. If you look at the judges that were involved in Julian's hearings in the UK, the conflicts of interest were glaring, right? Prior relationships with the British intelligence services, prior relationships with 10 Downing Street, so, and we'll get back, I think we're going to get back to this, things you were hitting on there, Kevin, and what Marjorie hit on as well. But Chip, I want to go to you because, it's already been brought up about Julian noting the change in society, right? And he made a bit of a joke about how some of that is the spooky sound of electric vehicles, right? Certainly, if someone who's been in captivity, that's going to be different. But he also noted, and this is the point, that Kevin and Marjorie have also brought up already, the live streaming of the genocide, and he compared that to 14 years ago, when the Collateral Murder video was released, and the shock of that to now that all of us have on our screens the live streaming of a genocide. So can you talk a bit about, Chip, how transnational repression, how it abets things such as what's occurring in Gaza, and in particular the murder of about 170 journalists in Gaza, something I know that your organization Defending Rights and Dissent, is working very much on.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to the question of transnational repression as a framing. I 100% think transnational repression is the correct framework to talk about this case for, but I also think it's a politically brilliant move. There is this move within the NGO space, within liberal members of the Democratic Congress in the US, to sort of make transnational repression into a thing. Every year, Adam Schiff, who is not a friend of Julian Assange, not a friend of our issues, puts forward a bill about transnational repression. And the goal of this bill is to sort of look at all of these things that countries we don't like do that are wrong, 100% wrong. But we have this sort of, I'm not a religious person, but I believe there's a Bible verse about being mindful of the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own. Yeah. And that was George W. Bush's favorite Bible verse. That's how I know it. And there is a real sort of be mindful of the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own, when you are the United States and you are talking about transnational repression. This is very much a buzzword in human rights circles. This is very much a buzzword amongst Democratic Party congressmen. And this is very much a buzzword, I would assume, in the Council of Europe, where there's a lot of interest in these human rights norms. And 100%, the idea of a case where someone exposes through journalism the U.S. government's war crimes, and they bring an antiquated, abusive prosecution under the Espionage Act. There is ample evidence they manipulated the process in Sweden and the European arrest warrant system. I'm not going to go too far into that because we'll be here for the next year. And they also plotted to kill him and have all these other acts of surveillance that I suspect a U.S. court would uphold, but I think a European court would be really, really shocked by. So if we're going to decide that transnational repression is one of the biggest threats to human rights today, and it very well may be, what better case of transnational repression is there than that of Julian Assange and the United States? And the fact that he is the quintessential case of transnational repression, but some of them, not all of them, the people who are hitting this drumbeat the loudest are also some of his biggest enemies, because they don't see this as about being human rights. They see this as a number of way to sort of politicize human rights, politicize press freedom. And, it's bad when the Russians do it. And it is bad when the Russians do it. It's bad when the Chinese do it, but it's not bad when we do it. And it certainly isn't bad when Israel does it, right? Everyone's favorite democracy in the Middle East. And I just thought that was a really brilliant framing. And I don't know if Julian Assange made that his framing because it's truthful and accurate, and it is, or if because he is aware of the trends going on within human rights spaces to sort of elevate this to a higher cause. As far as the Gaza journalists go, I was really heartened to see Julian Assange talk about the lack of journalistic solidarity in his case. The thing he noted that was very interesting were the first people to be angry about his case were the lawyers at the mainstream newspapers, like the New York Times, etc. Then it was the press freedom groups. I'd like to say Defending Rights to Dissent was angry before the word, but his timeline is actually probably correct. Then it was the journalists in the neutral countries and countries that are hostile to the U.S. and the journalists in the countries where they're allied to the U.S. or in the U.S. Were very slow and hesitant to get involved. And it is fascinating to think of this dynamic where, like, the New York Times general counsel is screaming, the sky is going to fall if this happens. And the New York Times reporter, who will be the person, not general counsel, who will go to prison, who will face these ramifications, like, I don't know. I've heard some things I don't like about him, all of which are false, obviously. And that is such an interesting dynamic. And the fact that he was so keenly aware of it just shows how sharp and insightful he is. Even after 5 years of isolation, he has a higher level of insight than a lot of people who make big bucks on CNN do. And you know, the whole thing, this is slightly off task. I was so impressed with how respectful the European parliamentarians were. They actually sat and listened. I mean, the US, one person speaks and everyone else is in the cafeteria or doing whatever else. And like, they actually sat and listened. They applauded him. And we have a ruling class in this country, both in the media and politics, that is just so uncurious about the rest of the world. I mean, I would go and I would meet with people who had worked in intelligence, who were on the intelligence committee, and tried to tell them, like, people in Europe really view Julian Assange as a political prisoner. They view him like you view Navalny. And as soon as I said that, they would just shut down and get really angry and say, no one thinks that, that's blah, blah, blah. And it's like, and I would say, you can think he's the devil. You can think he's the worst person. I mean, I don't, obviously. You can think anything you want, but your allies have huge parts of the population that view him as a political prisoner you are repressing. And I think the reception of him, the multiple applauses he got, illustrates that. And they would just totally shut their ears out and not listen to that. And, you know, we're seeing that repeated in a much larger scale with the ridiculousness of following in Israel in its criminal invasion of Lebanon, where there's just no understanding of anyone outside the Beltway bubble. As for the Gaza journalists, Defending Rights and Dissent, along with the Courage Foundation, which is the parent of Assange Defense, has been leading a campaign to call for an arms embargo on Israel, so long as it is killing journalists in Gaza. The lack of journalistic solidarity with Assange is on steroids with what we see in Gaza, where we see the journalists on the ground who are the only source of truthful information, because they're shuttering Al Jazeera, they're blocking foreign press, are being deliberately assassinated. And they just don't care. They don't care in Washington. And this is the last off-topic story. No, it's not true, obviously. This is...
Chip, I know you've got plenty in you. So
I'll tell this one last one. You know, I was outside the National Press Club when the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate called people to boycott it. And people put press vests, kind of like what Kevin's shirt said, with the names of journalists who had been killed and blood splattered on them. I watched a man in a tuxedo and a woman in a party dress step over those vests, the names of their dead colleagues, to go to this fancy party. So the lack of journalistic solidarity between Assange and Gaza is really, really distressing to me. And I was really heartened to see him make that connection.
Yeah, well said, Chip. You know, one of the things you're pointing out there, and this goes back to what Marjorie said 15, 20 minutes ago, this idea that this transnational repression, it's really an American problem. And at one point, Julian said national security reporting is possible in Europe, making that distinction. And I think you all have made it clear, this distinction that Julian was making between what Europe and the United States, and trying to drive a wedge between them. But Marjorie, going forward on all this, because I think this is a really important part of our conversation, going forward, what do you see as the dangers, as the possibilities, as well as what should be done? If you want to get into that, we can get in that later. But certainly going forward, how are you assessing this in terms of what's to come?
Well, I think we're going to see continual increased repression against journalists, like we're seeing in Gaza, where they assassinate journalists in cold blood. People know that all over the world, it's reported upon, and yet there is impunity. Just the way there has, and I think that Julian alluded to this, impunity for those people who ordered and committed war crimes. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes to remind people about why the US government wanted to get Julian Assange so badly. And that is because WikiLeaks revealed evidence of US war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. The Iraq war logs, 400,000 field reports documenting 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians sanctioned by the US government, rape, torture, murder, after U.S. forces transferred detainees to the notorious Iraqi torture squad. The Afghan War Diary, 90,000 reports that documented more civilian casualties by coalition forces than the U.S. military reported. And the Guantanamo files, 779 secret reports with evidence that 150 innocent men and boys had been tortured and abused at Guantanamo in violation of U.S. treaties. And of course, the collateral murder video where U.S. forces targeted and killed 12 unarmed civilians in cold blood in Baghdad, and then bragged about it. And Julian Assange made reference to these things and what WikiLeaks actually did. And so I think the impunity, not just for the people who committed the war crimes, and George W. Bush was right in the middle of a lot of that, by the way. When people say, oh, Bush wasn't as bad as Trump, keep in mind, George W. Bush is one of the, historically one of the leading war criminals in this country, along with his buddy Dick Cheney. But in terms of the impunity, we're seeing now impunity for Israeli leaders for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity in the occupied Palestinian territory, and impunity for U.S. leaders who are aiding and abetting that genocide. Aiding and abetting it can also be a theory of criminal punishment under the International Criminal Court. Now, the International Criminal Court prosecutor has asked for arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant and a couple of Hamas leaders. But so far, the ICC has not issued those arrest warrants. And there's been a tremendous pressure by the United States on the International Criminal Court not to indict people from Israel, from the U.S. So I think that impunity we're going to see more impunity. I think we're going to see more attacks on journalists. We're going to see assassinations of journalists. We're seeing it already. And hopefully the appearance of Julian Assange and what comes out of this Council of Europe Assembly, and I think that's really important. We can talk about, exactly what they're asking for in this rapporteur's draft, can be used as an organizing tool for progressive forces, journalists, lawyers, organizers all over the world to continue the ongoing and never-ending, apparently, struggle against U.S. imperialism.
Right. And he said that, Marjorie. He said, I think his quote was, "Impunity seems to mount." Right. So very almost dystopian, and Kevin, you and I both still have our Julian Assange posters on our wall. And, the question that comes at us is, he's a free man. Why do you still have it? And of course, this conversation explains why. So the dangers going forward for journalists, what was resolved by Julian's plea deal that set him free. and what more needs to be done. What do we need to be aware of? And of course, one thing I'm afraid we're going to forget to even say, so I'll say it right now, is that Julian still needs a pardon. So I just want to say that in case we all forget to mention that. But, Kevin, you're sitting here with your Assange poster still on the wall. Why is it still there?
Yeah, well, I admire that you're saying that I might have this poster on the wall because I just care about the issues. But this is the book that I wrote. So there's an air of like self-promotion to keeping the poster on my wall. But seriously, you put the question to me, and I think it's a good one, because Julian Assange, as anyone would after they become the target of a prosecution, is extremely familiar with the Espionage Act at this moment. He's been well advised by his legal team. He's thoroughly read documents and writings. He's talked to people. We shouldn't forget his mentor, Daniel Ellsberg, Pentagon Papers whistleblower, who he was speaking to while he was imprisoned, and that he understands the incompatibility between the First Amendment and the Espionage Act. And I think that if Julian Assange was a part of this conversation and could speak to what needs to happen now that he is able to readapt to life, as he put it, be with Stella, his wife, be with his children, be the dad that he had wanted to be for so long, he would say that we need to have consistently discussions about radically reforming the Espionage Act, or even go so far as to consider the abolition and replacement of it with something else. I mean, as the antiquated law that it is, he's right to say that people who are targeted under it are being accused of classic political offenses. And if you look at the history of the Espionage Act, and this is something that Chip can speak on very well as it relates to his work on the FBI, but in addition, this is something in which we all need to grapple with how it is used to enforce the secrecy of the classification system. So beyond the tool of it as a political repression, the political class has said, we find this to be useful in keeping secrets from the public. We find this to be useful in creating a deterrent to those who would publish truthful and honest information about what the government is doing in their name. And so I'll just say it very plainly. The war on whistleblowers that escalated and picked up while Julian Assange was in his heyday as the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief, publishing the award-winning journalism, that was a war on journalism. We always understood, if we knew what was happening to these whistleblowers, that it was a war on journalism. That war on journalism, in particular, was a war on accountability and justice. It meant that we were not able to go out and enforce the so-called rules-based order in a manner that made it so that the US, the UK, European countries, everyone had to obey it just as much as the global South, just as much as the people in Asia, the leaders in other parts of the world as well. And it was a war on the citizens' ability to access the truth about what their government does in their name. And that is even more acute now as we see what's happening in the Middle East with the Israeli government. I mean, I'll just shout someone who has done a whole book on this, and it has nothing to do with this conversation, or kind of does because we're touching upon the issues, but Norman Solomon did a really fantastic book documenting the way that war is made invisible. In the paperback edition, manages to come back and connect it to the war in Gaza. And I think those are good basic things to keep in mind as we're talking about this, because it runs in parallel. To conclude my response to you, it runs in parallel. The repression that's transnational and mostly coming from the United States, but crosses countries, is paired with that secrecy. It's paired with that revolutionizing of any efforts to pry loose records that would help people know that these are secret military operations. This is who funds them. This is who's being enriched. This is who makes the money. These are the people who benefit and profit off of war. This is who fights the wars. This is why we're fighting them. This is what we know. We know we're losing or we're not achieving these objectives. We know that we're not telling you the truth about what's going on with these wars. That campaign of secrecy is always paired with keeping whistleblowers and journalists from being able to disseminate that information.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Norman's book, Kevin, because it's a system, right? It's just not the government. It's just not the media. There's a system of collusion and complicity, government, media, but NGOs. Look at how bad PEN America was on this, right? I mean, and of course, corporations, particularly the technology corporations, their role in this. And so, Chip, you're of the four of us, you're the one who's sitting in the dark heart of the empire. You're the one who's in Washington, D.C. right now. What's the impact of today? What's the impact of June? I'm sorry to throw a question that's so exasperating, but, going forward, from your sit there and from what Defending Rights and Dissent does, what are you looking at going forward?
So Defending Rights and Dissent believes that Julian Assange's statement at his sentencing, I am guilty of journalism, but the First Amendment and the Espionage Act are in fundamental contradiction, is absolutely 150,000% correct. We have been saying this for years, and we are beginning a renewed campaign to take on the Espionage Act, not abolish it, as I think Kevin would like to, and I would also secretly like to, but to reform it enough that it cannot be used so easily against whistleblowers and it cannot be used against journalists. We are beginning a renewed campaign. Jeffrey Sterling, the CIA whistleblower, recently joined our board of directors. We're looking very forward to working with Jeffrey on Espionage Act reform. I've just produced for a congressional office, I won't say which one, a 20-page memo, of all the legal uses of the Espionage Act and all the legal problems with the bill. We are extremely serious. We're both serious in that we want to actually take on the problem. We're not one of these groups who comes up with a technocratic solution that's like, maybe a responsible CIA agent will agree with us, because that's not how we do things. But we're also seriously looking at the legal mechanisms of the Espionage Act. We're pulling up PACER and looking at what types of rulings judges have made about evidence, and really looking at how do you legally go in with a screwdriver or a hammer and rework the Espionage Act so it cannot be used in the way it is. And the big things are the Espionage Act should apply only to a limited set of foreign agents in some cases, and those with a duty to protect classified information, that's government employees and contractors, that government employees and contractors must have an affirmative public interest defense, and the Espionage Act must require the government to prove specific intent to harm national security. And the last one, a lot of people sleep on, but I've insisted for the last 7 years it's the most important one. And in the Joshua Schulte sentencing memo, the U.S. government said Joshua Schulte is the only defendant convicted under 793 of the Espionage Act. That's what they went after Julian Assange, Jeffrey Sterling, Reality Winner, Chelsea Manning under, who was not also charged with like a real espionage statute, who they believe had the intent to harm the country. Everyone else was acting out of misguided altruism or a delusion they were a whistleblower. So the U.S. government in a court record has said that in every single media leak prosecution but one, that person did not have the intent to harm the country. So if you raise that bar and the U.S. government follows the law, which I know it's always a big deal asking the U.S. government to follow the law and not reinvent it as they go on, none of those prosecutions except for one could have been brought. And this is a huge uphill battle. There's immense hostility towards it in the Congress, even amongst press freedom groups who think this is necessary, the attitude is, oh, well, you'll never change the Espionage Act. But people told me not to campaign to commute Chelsea Manning's sentence because Obama would do it. People said Julian would never be free. And we fought these battles because we had to, right? We don't have a choice but to take on the Espionage Act. And, you know, when I was giving these talks about Julian's case, I'd say, look, I can't sit here and tell you if we do everything possible, we do everything right, we win. But I can tell you if we sit here and do nothing, we lose. Okay?
Right.
So we are escalating our campaign against the Espionage Act, and we are escalating our campaign again. Well, we're starting a campaign against the killing of journalists in Gaza. Because in the process of working on Julian's case, I met many fine people like you all who understand how some of the big press freedom groups, who understand how some of the journalists lack solidarity with their colleagues when it matters the most. And for those of us who understand that press freedom matters because it allows us to expose empire, it allows us to expose war crimes, and those are the cases where press freedom groups, where press freedom advocates, where journalists are the least likely to speak out, we need to be galvanizing together to defend the brave journalists of Gaza who are being deliberately assassinated. Right. I mean, part of the problem in Gaza is they're murdering everyone in these genocidal bombardments. But even in spite of this indiscriminate killing, we see evidence they are targeting journalists and their family.
Right.
And that's where we're going next.
Yeah, and Chip, that point about the intent is so important, right? I mean, we have to keep hammering away, and the prosecutors and the Justice Department, they've shown that they're willing to understand intent for powerful and senior people. When General Petraeus provides all that classified information to his mistress and biographer, when Joe Biden keeps his classified information in his garage and provides it to his biographer, the Justice Department and the special prosecutors say, well, there was no intent there to do harm. You know, but that doesn't apply to Daniel Hale, say, right? I mean, so, you know, yeah. So, but we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to get back to something each of y'all said before we do our closing remarks. But Marjorie, you had brought up, and Chip just gave a really great rundown of what they're doing to deal with the Espionage Act. But you mentioned, Marjorie, you wanted to talk a little bit about what the resolution in Strasbourg from the Council of Europe has to say about Julian Assange and his persecution and prosecution and their recommendations going forward.
Yes, Matt. Well, tomorrow, Wednesday, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe is going to have a debate on a draft resolution written by the rapporteur from Iceland. And I think one of the key recommendations, or I guess I should say three of the key recommendations, are that the Assembly calls on the U.S. to urgently reform the Espionage Act to make its application conditional on the presence of a malicious intent to harm, like Chip was saying, malicious intent to harm the national security of the U.S. or aid a foreign power. That's the first thing. The second is the U.S. should exclude the application of the Espionage Act to publishers, journalists, and whistleblowers who disclose classified information with the intent to raise public awareness and inform about serious crimes such as murder, torture, corruption, or illegal surveillance. And third, to conduct to the U.S. now, conduct a thorough, impartial, and transparent investigation into alleged war crimes and human rights violations disclosed by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and hold those responsible to account, tackling a culture of impunity. And I think impunity is really the key word here, because not only are US leaders and UK leaders and Israeli leaders, etc., getting away with murder, they're getting away with war crimes. They're getting away with genocide. They're getting away with crimes against humanity. They're getting away with atrocities. And so I think that this recommendation that comes out of the Assembly of Parliamentarians for the Council of Europe is really, really critical.
Great. Thanks, Marjorie. And Kevin, you know, you had mentioned in a show of honesty why you still have Julian Assange's poster on the wall. But one of the things that Julian said today was that, this is a quote from him, journalists must be activists for the truth. And can you just respond to that, please?
It just boils it down to the essence of what people who work in news media need to understand now. And I think it will save the profession, which is in dire straits, which has never been in such a calamity where you see it shedding tens of thousands of jobs per year in the industry. And that is this whole false idea around objectivity that permeates particularly American journalism, but I suppose it's also part of the way that professionals are taught in Western journalism at large, is a thing of that you have to be neutral. And so much of what we see, first off, puts to the lie that anyone's being neutral. Nobody is being, again, let's just stick with current events because everyone has a way of understanding this. The idea that you not using the language that actually describes what is going on means you are still maintaining neutrality. We're seeing newspapers use headlines like ground operation or incursion, or just saying, like the New York Times did, Israel sends troops into Lebanon. Like for what? For a rescue mission? I mean, like what is, no, they're bombing and flattening apartment buildings and entire families are being massacred. So it's one of those things that Julian Assange understands. I think all of us here do. And the people who tune into it and who work in news media, who publish op-eds, who go on shows and have conversations, have to recognize that it is important to be activists for the truth. Now, the truth is subjective, like truth social. You would just presume maybe has a bunch of truth on it. And so I could join it. It'll be a great platform. So we do need to be mindful that there are people who take this word and make it devoid of any meaning. There's people like Adam Schiff who would say he was going after the truth in investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election, even though it's found all of those media stories. The Columbia Journalism Review publishes this extensive report that digs into all the things that never added up, even though journalists in the profession continued to push those falsehoods, which is just, this is a much larger question, but I'm just quickly representing that if you don't wake up now to what your responsibility is as a journalist, you will lose all credibility and you won't have authenticity. And I think you lose your audience. I think you start to lose the people who can see what's going on around you, because people feel the pressures. People feel what is happening. I'm sorry, I can't get this out of my head, but yesterday in Atlanta, the people in Georgia could not go outside because of a chemical explosion. They could not drink the water because a water main had exploded, but they couldn't go out and get bottled water because they couldn't get infected by chemicals. And so all of these things that we're seeing as civilization seems to crumble, people are looking to this impunity and seeing how offensive it is that those people get to get away with all of this. Meanwhile, there's all this pain, there's all this trauma being inflicted upon them. And if journalists don't wake up to this truth, then I just don't think there's any place for you. You're just going to be pushed aside and replaced by something else. And either we're going to get the people who are demagogues like Donald Trump who fill that void, or we're going to get nothing. We're going to just feel a vacuum. There's just going to be a vacuum where we don't actually get the information. So we never actually know what our government is doing. We just suspect it based upon our own paranoia.
Right. And Chip, we're running up against the end of the hour here. Before we go to closing statements, I'm going to give you a nice broad question and ask you to answer it in a minute or two. But this idea of the relationship between truth, journalism, and then getting results from that, right? So accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish with the Espionage Act, accomplishing what Marjorie just spoke to as to what the Council in Europe is recommending. Your view on that, how does that all interconnect? Very broad question, but I saw your face light up a couple of times when both Marjorie and Kevin were talking, and I thought you probably have some thoughts on this.
You are muted, though.
And Julian Assange did keep muting himself during the hearing, so we are in good company, Matt. In the 14 years of doing this, people kept coming out and says, any of it mattered. Was it worth it for Julian Assange to publish the Afghan war logs? Did anyone care? I think John Oliver did a really gross segment with Edward Snowden, where he sort of honed the same point. And, that's always been a hard one to think about, because we don't necessarily see the immediate value of truth. But what I've been starting to say, look at the ends to which governments are going to suppress the truth. The US went to extraordinary lengths to silence, shut up, disappear, and maybe kill Julian Assange. The Israeli government is shutting down Al Jazeera. It's banning foreign journalists. It is assassinating Palestinian journalists. The governments of the world believe truth matters. They believe truth is an agent of change, to the point where they are willing to kill people, to disappear people, to change their own laws, and tear up their own norms. And my position is, if the US and the Israeli government feel this way about truth, then we should too, and we should fight to defend it.
Very, very well said. Very well said. This has been a terrific hour. We could have gone for many more hours, or we can do other panels like this. I want to give each all a moment, a minute or so, just to kind of summarize, but also to let people know how they can follow you and how they can support your work. So Marjorie, please.
Yes, Matt. Well, it is incumbent upon all of us to follow Julian Assange's example and refuse to be intimidated from reporting government misconduct, notwithstanding the incredible and increasing threat of repression. Donald Trump said famously or infamously, the press is the enemy. He apparently has a hit list of 350 people. Lots of journalists are on that hit list. But that should not deter us. We need to continue to fight and struggle against impunity and get the truth out, regardless of the consequences.
Okay, and Kevin?
I think of what Julian Assange had to say about censorship and journalists being killed. And I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but this idea that everything that the U.S. government did to him, you can draw a through line, and it relates to the freedom of expression, the risks to freedom of expression that we're seeing now. The students that are inspiring to me, who go out on their college and university campuses and protest, even though they know their administrators are going to shut them down. The student journalists that go out there then to cover, and their administrators do everything they can to block them from covering how they deploy police against their students. And that's a press freedom issue. The censorship regime imposed by Israel that has the full support of the U.S. government, that's that, and how Al Jazeera is being shut down in the West Bank. That's a freedom of press issue, and that grows out of what we've seen the U.S. do to Julian Assange, in my opinion. So we need to be mindful of how all of this connects and builds upon everything. So that's the last thing that I'll say. And you can follow my work at thedissenter.org. It's a newsletter on whistleblowers, press freedom, and government secrecy. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. And Marjorie, where can people follow your work before we go to Chip?
Yes, I write a regular column called Human Rights and Global Wrongs, and it's on truthout.org. And my writings and videos, etc., are also collected on my own website, marjoriecohn.com.
Great, thank you. And Chip, your final comments, please. And where can people follow and support you?
I really want to implore people to support Defending Rights and Dissent. Defending Rights and Dissent was one of the first groups on this. My coworker and boss, Sue Udry, organized one of the first, if not the first, protest to free Chelsea Manning. We literally were there from day one. We never did the sort of hedging our bets, sort of, should we support him, should we not? Every step of the way, we were leading the way in Washington. And it doesn't make us a lot of friends in Washington, D.C. It doesn't even always make us friends with some of the other NGOs who purport to care about these issues. But it has made us friends all over the world of people who still believe in truth, who still believe in the tradition of civil liberties, and journalism of I.F. Stone and people of that variety. And if you support our work, if you think there should be people like Defending Rights and Dissent, I would really urge you to support us, because we're not getting the big foundation money. We're not making the big friends. There is very little interest in helping Julian Assange. There's very little interest in helping the Palestinian journalist. There's next to no interest in taking on the FBI anymore, because they're the good guys, right? Now. And if you think this type of work matters, please support us. I'm going to continue writing about the Assange case for Jacobin and The Nation and elsewhere. I'm supposed to be writing a book for Verso. I always said my publisher should have filed an amicus brief asking me to dismiss the charges so I could get back to work. I don't think the U.S. government would have liked that. But my final thought is that, people said we couldn't free Chelsea Manning. We did. She got a commutation, not a pardon. She deserved a pardon. People said we couldn't free Julian Assange. He got, all things considered, a pretty good plea deal, but he was still forced to plead guilty to journalism. We can win these fights if we fight them, even when they're imperfect or partial victories. And it means we have to keep going. We cannot say, okay, it's over now. We have to start fighting to reform the Espionage Act, to defend the people telling the truth about Gaza, because this Assange, it's not a legal precedent, but it's a political precedent. It comes at a time where I don't think we've ever been more in need of a Daniel Ellsberg or a Chelsea Manning or a WikiLeaks to tell us what our government is doing with Gaza and Lebanon. And we know there are record levels of dissent within the government not seen since the Vietnam War, not the Iraq War, the Vietnam War. Imagine if there was no Espionage Act. Imagine if there was no surveillance of journalists, and imagine if there was still vibrant, independent media sites like WikiLeaks, what we would be hearing. So this attack is an attack on all of our rights to know, all of our rights to receive information. The First Amendment both gives a right to the speaker and the journalist to publish, but it also gives a right to the American people to receive information.
Right.
When they silence Julian Assange, when they jail Daniel Hale, when they torture Chelsea Manning, they do not just violate that person's rights. They violate the right of every single American under the First Amendment to receive information and ideas.
Thank you so much for that, Chip. I'm going to close by reading Julian Assange's closing statement because I found it to be very poignant, and I think it summarizes as well the remarks you all have made here today, but also includes a further point. But this was Julian's closing statement. In 2010, I was living in Paris. I went to the United Kingdom and never came back until now. It's good to be back. It's good to be amongst people who, as we say in Australia, who give a damn. It's good to be amongst friends. I would just like to thank all the people who have fought for my liberation and who have understood, importantly, that my liberation was coupled with their own liberation, that the basic fundamental liberties which sustain us all have to be fought for, and that when one of us falls through the cracks, soon enough, those cracks will widen and take the rest of us down. Thank you for your thought, your courage in this and other settings, and keep up the fight. And that was Julian Assange's closing statement today. And I don't think I need to say anything further than that, other than to thank Marjorie, Kevin, and Chip for being here with us today. Thanks to Defending Rights and Dissent, Assange Defense for putting this together. Please support those organizations. Again, Defending Rights and Dissent, Assange Defense, the Courage Foundation, WikiLeaks. There are a number of places that continue to need your support going forward. And thank you for watching this. And of course, thank you, as Julian and the panel have said, to everyone who worked so tirelessly, so hard over a decade and a half to make Julian Assange a free man, to allow him to be with his family today, but with the realization that there still is a heck of a lot of fight to go. So thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.